Hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County. I'm joining you today to talk about insects and plant diseases in our home vegetable gardens. And if you're watching a recording of this, I'm going to be dividing this up into two different sections. The first part of that, which I hope you're watching first, is going to be part one, is going to talk about different insects you may encounter in your home vegetable garden. And then part two, I'm going to go into some detail on different plant diseases that you may encounter, as well as talk generally about plant diseases and how we can manage them to make our home vegetable gardens happy and healthy and productive. So I do encourage you to go to the MSU Extension website. There's some really wonderful information there on insects and, of course, plant diseases as well for vegetable gardens. And those resources will be really helpful for you. There's an excellent publication, which is Insects of the Home Vegetable Garden, as well as some really great resources on different plants and different plant diseases. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, talk about insects in the home vegetable garden. And our home gardens are composed of a whole bunch of different kinds of plants. And because of that, we have a wide array of different insects that we may encounter in our home gardens. A lot of those can be pests, and a lot of them can be beneficials for us as well. When we're talking about insect pests, it's important that we understand that insects can damage our plants in several different ways. The first of those, and probably the easiest to think of, is direct damage, and that's going to be feeding on the part of the plant that we actually harvest. And after that, we can talk about indirect damage, feeding on the foliage, feeding on plant sap. And because of that feeding on foliage or plant sap, they reduce the vigor of the plant, reduce its ability to draw in energy, and may reduce our yields because of that. Now, in addition to direct and indirect damage, we also have the potential for some insects to spread disease. Particularly plant viruses are often spread by insects. So pest insects can cause on average 20 to 30% losses in our vegetable and in our fruit production. In addition to that damage to our production, we also have a reduction in the beauty of our plants, so those insects can negatively impact the appearance of ornamentals. And again, as I've mentioned, some insects can also transmit plant diseases for both vegetable and ornamental plants. And there in image B, you can see an example of a disease that is transmitted by an insect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a range of different insect groups. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the biology of that insect, as well as some information on how we can help to manage that insect to reduce its populations below where it's actually going to be a problem for us. And aphids are an insect that we often find in gardens, whether they be vegetable gardens or ornamental gardens. There's aphid species that can be problems in either. Aphids themselves, very small, soft-bodied insects, and have a piercing, sucking mouthpart. So what that means is that their mouth is kind of like we might imagine the mouth of a mosquito. They stab that mouthpart down into the plant and they draw out the plant sap. And aphid populations can build up very, very quickly. So the female aphids are capable of something called parthenogenesis, where they actually give birth to more female aphids that are already ready to be able to reproduce without the intervention of a male. Because of that, because they have a very short generation time, the populations of aphids can just explode very quickly, making management of them particularly important. Another important thing about aphids is that they are potential transmitters of plant diseases, particularly plant viruses that can negatively impact our plants. Now, sometimes aphids can be controlled by beneficial insects or diseases that the aphids get, but we can't necessarily rely on those beneficial insects or beneficial diseases to keep those populations down. So it may be important to apply insecticides in order to reduce aphid populations. Very commonly, insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils are used to reduce aphid populations, and those can be very effective, so long as we get really good coverage of the plant. Because those insecticides work essentially by directly contacting that insect, if we don't get very thorough coverage of the plant, it's possible for aphid populations to, again, just continue to expand. Another thing I'd like to mention about aphids is because they're drawing in those sugars from the plant, their digestive system is a little simple. A lot of the sugars come out the other end of the aphid, and we euphemistically call that honeydew. And often plants that are affected with large populations with aphids will be covered in that sticky material. And something that does occasionally happen is there's a fungus that thrives on that honeydew, has a dark appearance, and we call that sooty mold. In extreme cases, that can cover the plant, actually interrupt its ability to photosynthesize, cause it problems. Now, the best way to manage sooty mold is to remove the aphid populations or the other insects that may produce honeydew. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then that sooty mold material, that fungus, can just be washed off of the plants or will wear off on its own. Other insecticides that can be used for aphids include permethrins. Those, again, very effective, can be used right up to the day of harvest. And in extreme cases, you may need to use malathion to control aphid populations just to keep them down. Another common insect that we find in vegetable gardens, but can also be found in ornamental gardens, is whiteflies. Now, whiteflies are relatively easy to identify because of their behavior. If, when you contact your plant or if you shake your plant, a large number of little whiteflies fly all around your plant, then you do have a whitefly infestation. Now, while they're easy to identify, they can be very difficult to control because the adults are very mobile, can fly away, and so in spraying the plant, you're very likely to miss the adults. So what we're going to try to do when we control those whitefly populations is we're going to try to control the immatures, which, just like the immatures of all insects, are flightless, aren't able to move away from where we're applying that control. And so, again, insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils may be effective. And some other insecticides can also be used, the permethrin classes, and again, malathion can work for that. We do want to make sure if we're using a horticultural oil or an insecticidal soap that we make sure we apply that very thoroughly to the underside of leaves. And like aphids, whiteflies do produce honeydew, and because of that, they can result in that sooty mold condition occurring on the plant. And also, very similarly to aphids, whiteflies are capable of transmitting some viral diseases. A little bit more specialized of an insect are leaf miners. Down here in coastal Mississippi, one of the more frequent insects that I get asked to identify is the citrus leaf miner. And you can see damage caused by that over in the image that's going to be on the right side of your screen there. So the adult leaf miner lays an egg, and as that caterpillar hatches out, it bores down into the leaf, and then it makes those tunnels, which can cause deformation of the leaf, cause it to curl up and turn brown. But you can actually see the pathway that the caterpillar has followed as it's eaten its way through that leaf. Similarly, there are leaf miners that I very often see on tomato plants, and you can see that in the image below there, where very similarly you can see the pathway that that immature insect has moved on through that leaf. Now, at low population levels, leaf miners are not a severe problem. While they do damage to the leaf, you really need more than about 50% of the leaves affected before you're actually going to see a reduction in yields because of this insect. That being said, particularly on our citrus trees, the feeding of leaf miners can be really unattractive. A lot of people control it for cosmetic reasons before it gets to that level. As far as control of leaf miners, the best insecticidal option, really the only effective insecticidal option, particularly for citrus leaf miners, is the use of a spinosyn insecticide, often called spinosad. And a trade name for that is Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew, which is pretty easy to remember. Just keep in mind, that you really have to have a systemic insecticide that's going to be able to get into that leaf in order to effectively control that leaf mite. Now, when we talk about beetles, there are several different beetles that can be potentially damaging to particularly our vegetable crops. I'm going to start off talking about flea beetles. Now, these are a relatively small insect, around 1/4 of an inch or smaller, and they're very easy to distinguish because they're called flea beetles because they do actually jump when they're disturbed. So if you see a small beetle in a leaf and as you're attempting to catch it, it leaps away from you, it's a really good sign that what you're dealing with is a flea beetle. Now, characteristically, the damage that you're going to see is what we call that, gives that leaf that shot hole appearance, as if it's been shot through with a whole bunch of different holes, usually little round holes all over the leaves. This can be very serious, particularly on our leafy vegetables. Large infestations early in the year can really damage new transplants and seedlings. Smaller plants, larger plants tend to be less affected by this, though again, it can be unattractive. Now, one thing that can be effective as a cultural practice to help reduce problems with flea beetles is to reduce weeds, particularly horse nettle, in the area of the garden, as that serves as an alternative host for flea beetles. They'll often build up their population there early in the season and then move on to your crop. As far as insecticidal management, you have several options. So the bifenthrin type insecticides, so Ortho Bug Begone, as well as Carbaryl, which is sold as 7. 7 is also occasionally Zeta cypermethrin, very effective at control of flea beetles. Cucumber beetles, another common beetle insect that we find here in our gardens. There are several different species of cucumber beetles, included probably the most common, the spotted cucumber beetle, and you see that as the middle picture there. And then we have the banded cucumber beetle. A little bit less commonly encountered is the striped cucumber beetle. All behave very similarly and feed very similarly and should be managed fairly similarly. As you might expect from their name, they are commonly found on cucurbits like cucumbers and squash and zucchini. We also find them on legumes, so you'll find them on beans and other plants. And they will feed heavily on leaves, may also scar the surface of the fruit. You can see some of that fruit scarring there in that picture down at the bottom. Managing cucumber beetles, very similar to flea beetles. Those same insecticides can be effective in management. So 7 or Carbaryl, bifenthrin or Ortho Bug Begone, very effective in management of cucumber beetles. And permethrin type insecticides are also going to work fairly well for these. Now, there are a large number of beetles out there, largest group of insects in total. So there are a wide array of different beetles. Here we have a picture of the Mexican bean beetle that is on the top left, the bean leaf beetle on your top right, Colorado potato beetle, and down there in the bottom right is a blister beetle. Now, of course, all these insects feed very similarly by defoliating, feeding on the leaves, and they also feed directly on the pods of peas and beans and directly damage plants that way. I do want to mention especially the blister beetle. It is aptly named. So the hemolymph, for the blood of the insect, contains a chemical in it that can actually chemically burn the skin. So if you see an insect that looks like that, be really careful if you're going to manage it or try to handle it at all, because if you crush the beetle or break its exoskeleton and get some of that chemical on you, it can be extraordinarily unpleasant. And I do spend a lot of time talking about different insect pests and how to get rid of them. But I do like to occasionally just include something to show off the beauty of some of the insects we have in the world. So I've included there the golden tortoise beetle, just because it's such an attractive insect, adds a little bit of beauty to the presentation. So moving on, the bane of gardeners everywhere are stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs. These can be extraordinarily damaging insects and can be a little bit difficult to manage. And they actually feed very similarly to aphids and whiteflies. As we discussed earlier, they have a piercing, sucking mouthpart, stab down into the plant and draw out that sap. Of course, they're much larger than an aphid or a whitefly would be. And that feeding can distort the plant, can cause severe damage, particularly to fruit. One of the things you'll see, particularly in tomatoes, if you look down there in the bottom right, there's an image of a tomato that's been fed on by a stink bug or a leaf-footed bug. And you can see all those yellow spots, and essentially that area of the fruit has been damaged by feeding. They've inserted their mouth part there and drawn out the sap. And inside, if you open up that tomato, you're going to find a hard section that's kind of walled off from the rest of the fruit. It's just going to be very unpleasant. Of course, they also reduce the vigor of plants. And again, you can have a little bit of distortion, particularly in the growth of the plant, because they feed on one side and kill the cells of that plant there. The other side isn't damaged, so it can grow a little bit strange. We do tend to see high populations of stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs later in the season, and they can be a little bit resistant to pesticides. You can get knockdown of them with a permethrin insecticide, but very often what you'll do is you'll knock them off the plant. That won't actually kill the insect. The new formulation of 7, that's that Zeta cypermethrin product, is showing some really good efficacy. I've had good control of stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs with it. But malathion is another insecticide that's very commonly used for control of stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs. One difficulty for stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs is it's really difficult to find an effective organic management tool for these. One of the permethrin type insecticides is going to be really your best bet there. Occasionally, it can be an effective method is to actually remove the egg masses. If you look particularly on the lower leaves in the canopy and sometimes on the underside of leaves, you will see their eggs grouped together. You can see a picture of that down on the bottom there. And the physical removal of those egg masses can be a really quick, easy way to remove the stink bugs or leaf-footed bugs from the plant. I just want to show a quick picture there. The middle picture to the left, you see a lot of the immature leaf-footed bugs aggregating there on the plant or just grouped together. And that's something we very commonly see. And we can occasionally have some confusion between the immature leaf-footed bugs and assassin bugs. If you see them all grouped together like that, really good sign that what you have is leaf-footed bugs and you want to get effective control of that. Very similarly, we have the squash bug. This is, of course, a very serious pest of squash. They do feed and damage plants kind of very similarly. They insert that mouth part. And very often we're going to find these down near the base of the plant. And also very, very similarly, you can find the egg masses. They're very characteristic and kind of an orange color, just right on the surface of the leaves and grouped together the same way you would see stink bug eggs. And physically removing these eggs can be a method of controlling them. If we don't manage them, because they can occur in large numbers, you're feeding on the plant, we can actually get plants wilting or dying overnight when the squash bugs are in high numbers. So we want to be really effective about managing these. Early malathion has been an effective way to do that. It's also a good idea if you have plants in the garden that aren't producing to remove those because they may serve as a source of squash bugs that can then move to other plants. I'll talk a little bit about caterpillars. Armyworms are one of the first kinds that we'll encounter. The true armyworm occurs fairly early in the season, and then we'll see the fall armyworm in the fall, obviously. And there are several other species of armyworm, all kind of feeding the same way. And if you really want to closely identify them, you can look at their head, and they have that really distinctive Y shape there that tells you that you definitely do have an armyworm. And generally, they cause damage by feeding on leaves. And they can be effectively controlled ideally by, if you're monitoring your plants very thoroughly, catch those populations early when the insects are still small. Then you can use a BT insecticide. BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's very effective and targets caterpillars especially. Doesn't do any damage to any other kind of insect. So you just get that targeted control. Very effective. If not, then either carbaryl or bifenthrin are effective for control of armyworms. That would be either 7 or orthobugbigone. Very destructive insect pest, the tomato fruitworm, also known as the corn earworm and a number of other different names. One of the real problems with this insect is that it bores into fruit. It can also be a defoliating pest. And once the insect is actually born into the fruit, it is very difficult to get effective control. So again, the best thing we can do for managing this, really monitoring our plants, looking to find these populations when they're small, apply that BT insecticide to get effective control of them. Use either carbaryl or bifenthrin 7 or orthobugbigone if they've gotten larger. If you've got a high population, again, malathion can be pretty effective. Again, this pest can be extraordinarily damaging to tomatoes. Obviously, also a very damaging pest of sweet corn. So something that we want to make sure that we have effective control of. Common insect that we'll find, particularly on cabbages and other leafy vegetables, looper insects have a really characteristic way of moving. They kind of move like an inchworm. So they kind of hump their body up and then stretch out. And they're named for that distinctive kind of movement. You'll occasionally see them gripping the plant with their hind legs, sort of stretching their body upwards. It can be very damaging to cabbages, but you'll also occasionally find them in legumes as well. Young caterpillars will feed on leaves, leaving a really characteristic sign of their presence. We call it window painting, where they've left the upper epidermis of the leaf intact. So there's a little filmy residue that's still over that open area of the leaf. We call that window painting. Really good sign that we want to control those loopers. And we're going to control them the same way as we're attacking our other caterpillar pests. Of course, a very serious pest in our vegetable gardens is the tomato hornworm. Very similarly, the tobacco hornworm can be a little bit challenging to tell the two apart. They all have that really distinctive, incredibly large size, as well as that horn on the end of their body. And they can consume a very large amount of leaf tissue very quickly because of their large size. We also see direct damage from feeding of these. They'll feed directly on the fruit. And occasionally we do actually see a little bit of management of this insect pest by the use of a beneficial insect, a parasitic wasp. And you can see an image there of the pupae of those parasitic wasps coming out of that caterpillar, which tells you that they've done a really good job of knocking down that hornworm. Because hornworms are extraordinarily damaging, a lot of times we don't find them until they're quite large. Again, I really advise just a regular monitoring program. Go out, spend that time in the garden, look for any damage as defoliation, see if you can find any caterpillars. The earlier that you catch these pests, the better job you're going to do of getting effective control. Once you see them, you do need to make sure that you use an effective insecticide. Now, if you only have a couple of plants, you can physically remove these hornworms from the plant. I have found in my experience, their camouflage is better than you might expect, especially considering their large size. So even after I think that I've by eye removed all of these hornworms, as I look a little bit closer, I'll often find one or two more. And I've really gotten to the point where I just run my hands along all of the branches of the plant, trying to make sure that I catch them all. And I'll always find one or two more using feel rather than sight, trying to remove them. You can control them with insecticides. You want to use something really effective. Malathion works very well for control of these, getting really rapid control, and you need that because, again, they can very quickly defoliate your plants as well as directly damage the fruit. So I mentioned several times the use of different insecticides in your vegetable garden, and I want to just take a moment to talk about the use of insecticides. And just like any garden tool, insecticides have a proper time to be used. We want to make sure that we're using them properly. A really important part of that is to read and understand the label of that insecticide. You can always find that usually by peeling back the front cover, or there'll be a little booklet attached to the back. You want to make sure that you're following the directions there, not applying it somewhere where you shouldn't, not trying to control something with it that it's not registered for, and making sure that you are doing the application correctly in terms of what you're wearing, the equipment that you're using to put out that insecticide, and the concentration of the insecticide that you're using. All that information is going to be on the label. We want to make sure that we obey that label, not only because that's really how that insecticide is going to be most effective, but also for safety. So again, the information that's going to be there on the label is going to be first of all, the crop that we're trying to apply that insecticide to. So make sure you can use it on vegetables or on the specific vegetable that you are using it on. That's going to be effective for the pest you're attempting to manage. Follow those directions for mixing. There is always a temptation, if it says to add 2 ounces to a gallon of water, to increase that, and I really encourage you not to do that. It's not going to make that insecticide any more effective. It's just costing you extra money and potentially leading to an unsafe condition. Make sure you mix that correctly. Make sure you apply it correctly to the plant. Follow that direction for protective clothing. One thing that can be very important in the selection of an insecticide is paying attention to what's called the pre-harvest interval. And what that means is once you've applied that insecticide, there may be a period of time that you need to wait before you can actually harvest those vegetables. So if you know you're planning on picking your tomatoes tomorrow, you certainly don't want to apply an insecticide that may have a 7-day pre-harvest interval. And so you want to select something that's going to have that shorter window. And pre-harvest intervals vary everywhere from 0 days for many of the permethrin formulations up to potentially 7 or 14 days for different insecticides on different plants. You also want to make sure that you're following directions for storage of insecticides. We want them to keep their efficacy. And if it does come to a point where you're going to throw them away, you want to make sure that you follow the correct directions for disposal. A lot of them are not things that you need to just throw in the trash. So make sure you're paying attention to that for everyone's safety. And that being said, there are a lot of forms of different non-insecticidal insect controls. I'm going to talk about a few of those, starting with mechanical control. And that's a lot of times just physical removal or barriers. I'm also going to talk about cultural control, ways we can grow the plants that may allow us to more easily manage insect pests. And then finally, I'm going to be mentioning biological control just very briefly. For all of these, I would encourage you to watch the other video. It's going to be on my YouTube channel on diversity and insect pests. So a lot of this information is going to be presented a little bit more thoroughly in that video. Starting with mechanical control, that can be anything up to hand removal of eggs or the insects themselves. Now we mentioned for stink bugs and squash bugs, that physical removal of eggs in order to keep their populations down. Of course, we also mentioned for the tomato hornworm, just physically removing those caterpillars, getting them off the plant. And if you have a small number of plants, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that as a method for control. Similarly, if you have aphid populations, And I see this more often on ornamental plants than in vegetables. You can actually use water, a little bit of pressure, and you can just wash the aphids off the plant. With vegetables, you have the issue that the plant is often a little bit more tender, and so if you're using that pressurized water, you may wind up with some damage to your plant that way. Also, physical barriers can be very effective to prevent the insects from being able to reach the plant. Often we see these in protective structures, but we can also use mulches. You can see a plastic mulch being used there in the top picture. Just physical barriers like plastic around your plants, and that's obviously a situation earlier in the year because you're going to get the greenhouse effect inside that row cover. But that does work as a physical barrier to keep those insects away from your plants. Netting can also work for some of the moth species and other insects like that. In terms of cultural control, early planting is one way that we can avoid some problems with insects by not going too far into the season. Insect populations tend to build up naturally as we go through the year. So by planting early, we can go ahead and harvest, get out of our production by the time those insect populations get really high, and that can be an effective way to keep down problems with insects. Another thing that we really want to make sure we do is remove plant debris from the area of the garden. Just make sure that we do that sanitation because that can serve as a place where the insects can either overwinter or nest or lay eggs. And by cleaning up that area, we avoid that habitat for them being present in the garden. Similarly, removing weeds from around the garden area can remove alternative hosts that serve as a source for those pests to then move into the garden. Again, going back to the flea beetles and horse nettle is an example of that. So by making sure we do some really good weeding around the area of the garden, we deny the insects that habitat, don't give an area where they can build up and then move on to our plants. Now, even our own plants, our vegetables that might be there in the garden, we have a plant that's not being productive, if it's already finished out its year, or if it's unhealthy in some way and not going to produce any fruit for us, we want to go ahead and remove that plant because all it's doing is serving as, again, a potential source of the pests to build up. Also encourage people to use resistant varieties. Normally when we talk about resistant varieties, we think about plant diseases, but there are some varieties of vegetable plants that are going to be resistant to particular pests. And essentially, or especially if you have a problem or have a history of a problem with a particular pest, looking out for that resistance is a really good idea. I also encourage you just to make sure your plants are really healthy, make sure they're watered evenly, make sure you've done everything you can to properly fertilize them, because healthy plants are going to be better able to tolerate that insect damage. As we talk very briefly about beneficial insects fall into several different categories. They may be predators. A good classic example of that is the lady beetle, which is a predator of aphids. So it's just going to be directly reducing the populations of those insect pests. We also have parasitoids, and usually these are a range of different kinds of wasps that lay their eggs into different insect pests, caterpillars, and the eggs of some other species. And then those larvae actually develop inside the pest, inside the caterpillar, as you can see the picture there. And then they'll pupate and come to the outside before going off to affect other insects. And also talking about beneficial insects, it's important to consider pollinators, both bee populations and different butterfly populations. Now, when we want to attract beneficial insects, the best thing we can do is to provide habitat for those insects. So provide plants that are going to favor those insects, including flowers near our vegetable gardens is a wonderful way of doing that, not only for the good it does, drawing in those beneficial insect populations, but also just beautifying the space. It's really going to bring in a lot more pollinators, a lot more insect predators than we would have otherwise. Now, obviously, on those plants that we're bringing in beneficial insects, or that we're using to bring in beneficial insects, we do want to limit insecticide applications because a lot of times those insecticide applications can also do damage to beneficial insect populations. Now, that comes with a really important statement that while certainly we do want us to preserve the populations of beneficial insects, we want to make sure that they're doing their job, helping us keep down those populations of pests. We shouldn't avoid spraying specifically because, or only because, we're trying to protect that beneficial insect population. Once we have a damaging population of a pest, we really need to make sure we're taking a control action, applying what we need to apply in order to reduce that pest population. The idea of beneficial insects, the good that they're going to do for us, is ideally preventing that pest population from ever getting to a level where we would actually need to apply that control. Just to continue on, we do also want to make sure that we're providing water sources for beneficials. Really good example of that is butterflies. In a butterfly garden, it's always a good idea to have some rocks where we can have some water accumulate, because the butterflies like to come out and get their water from that rock surface. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end this video here. I appreciate you joining me. Again, I want to mention there's some really great resources for you on the MSU Extension website, extension.msstate.edu, particularly in regarding insects for home vegetable gardens. All the information that you need to help manage those. Really encourage you to go there. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to email me, as well as contact your county extension agent. Use that as a wonderful resource for your information. We're always here to give you a hand. And I hope that you'll join me in part 2 of this presentation, where I'll be talking about plant disease.